started, so everybody better be sitting down. Our first speaker for the post-coffee break. I know, now you guys are all hopped up on caffeine. Let's, yeah, it's okay. Okay, so our first speaker is Lammim Ahad, and she'll be talking about an environmental dependent halo mass function as a driver for the early quenching of cluster galaxies. Take it away.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And before I start, I'd like to thank the organizers for this very interesting conference and also for giving me the opportunity to present my work. I am Lammim Ahad, currently a WCA postdoc fellow at the University of Waterloo. And this work is mainly from my PhD work at Leiden Observatory that I defended only a couple of months ago, so I'm very excited to be here. While I show you my attempt at putting some pretty pictures in my talk, I'd like to thank Benedetta and Greg for their excellent talks, because I think that basically gave the main introduction of why we care about what quenched galaxies in clusters at redshift 1.5 and above, which used to be high redshift, probably still is for clusters. But just add to the main motivation, I'd like to draw your attention to this very famous plot from Peng et al. In their 2010 paper. So basically, based on the observation of local clusters, we understood that, or we saw that if we go for more massive galaxies, and if we look at denser environment, the fraction of red and dead galaxies tend to increase. And to reproduce these observations, simple empirical models like the one presented by Peng et al. Seem to be very successful. And when I call it simple empirical models, it's because it's based on two very simple but effective assumptions, and those being that the effect of mass and environment in quenching galaxies are separable. And number two is that the clusters grow from accumulations of galaxies from the field. So basically, the halos, the cluster halos, or the distribution of galaxies in cluster and field halos are not very different. Now, while that is true for based on the observation of local universe, we see that it starts to break even at as early as redshift 0.3. So the separable effect of mass and environmental quenching is not visible from as early as redshift 0.3 out to redshift 3 or higher. And of course, for the observations based on clusters at 1.5, and more specifically from the Gauguin clusters, as we already heard from Greg's talk, is that a lot of the things don't really add up. We see that the mass function especially is very similar for filled and quenched galaxies. Only the total fraction of quenched galaxies go higher, which means that whatever we understand by environmental quenching at lower shift may not be the case if we go at these higher redshift clusters. So in our attempt to look at this, we really zone in on the question, or like the assumption from the Peng model, for example, which is that clusters grow from accumulation of field galaxies. So we want to understand what if it is not true at higher redshift, and can that be used to understand this age discrepancy that we see in the Gauguin clusters? And because we're interested in the halo masses of individual galaxies and other halo properties, we use the best tool available for us for that, which is using cosmological hydrodynamical simulations. We use the hydrangea simulation suite, which is a suite of 24 massive clusters. These are zoom-in simulations that were run using the Eagle galaxy formation code. And by massive clusters, I mean clusters that have more than 10 to the power 15 solar masses at redshift 0. Now, we already showed in previous works that these simulations show pretty good agreement out to redshift 2 for stellar properties of galaxies, and more specifically, I'd like to draw attention to this plot where we compared the mass function or stellar mass function from hydrangea with observations of clusters, and especially the one at the right panel at redshift 1.3. This is the Gauguin stellar mass functions shown in the black data point from Remco van der Berg's paper, and the mass function from Gauguin is in black, and the red one is coming from hydrangea. So we see that they have pretty good agreement, especially if we look at more more massive and like more than 10 to the power 10 solar masses, the galaxies which we are really more interested to understand. So yes, we start with this question that are cluster and field halos different at this redshift? And for that, we look into an analog of the halo mass function. So instead of the halo masses, we look into the distribution of Vmax peak, as you can see here, and this is just showing the number counts. So what is Vmax peak? Vmax is the maximum rotational velocity of the stars in each of the galaxies, and the Vmax peak is basically the peak value of this Vmax from the point the galaxy emerged in the simulation until the point we are looking at it. So here, for this case, it's at redshift 1.5. The purple data points are showing the hydrangea clusters, and the orange data points are showing us field galaxies, which is taken from the Eagle 50 megaparsec cube volume run, which was run using the exact same code that was used from hydrangea, so it reduces the bias of comparison, basically. So, of course, for clusters, we see there is this really high Vmax peak values, but these we know are the central giant galaxies. These are the BCGs in these clusters, and we expect them to have really high Vmax peak value or really high halo masses. So that is not very interesting for our purpose, but what we care about is this range where the Vmax peak values are comparable between field and cluster halos. And as you can see, something above 300 Vmax peak values, we see that there is a higher number of galaxies in clusters compared to the field. So basically, the slope of how the total number of halos are distributed is completely different in cluster and field. And I forgot to mention that these are normalized by numbers. So of course, in clusters, we are seeing more number of halos, but this is basically showing us that if we gave the same number of galaxy halos in a cluster and in a field, how would they distribute themselves in terms of their Vmax peak? Thank you. Thanks a lot. And yeah, so to quantify this difference in their halo mass distribution, we look at the slope of this comparable region, as you can see, and then in the right plot you see that from redshift 1.5 out to even redshift 3, the slope is clearly different. So basically, in cluster, we see there is a shallower slope, and in comparable region, there is always a higher number of high mass galaxy halos. So that's great, but how can do we see any correlation of that with the quench fraction? For this, we look into another analogous plot. So this is analogous to the well-known stellar to halo mass relation. So here in the y-axis, we're seeing the Vmax peak, and in the x-axis, we're seeing the stellar mass. So the left side is showing us the cluster, hydrangea cluster galaxies, and the right side is showing us Eagle field galaxies. But because we can also separate it further, in the left plot we're only showing the satellites from Eagle, hydrangea, and in the right one we're showing the central galaxies from Eagle. So how that helps us is, of course, in the Eagle galaxies we see here, whatever is quenching them has to be intrinsic, whereas in clusters it could be intrinsic or environmental processes. Now in both panels, the red data points are showing the quenched galaxies, the blue ones are star forming, and there are mainly two key points as we see here. So first of all, not surprisingly compared to the field, we see way more quenched galaxies in clusters. But what is interesting is that if you look into the black dotted and these like dotted and dashed lines, these are showing us the running median value of the Vmax peak in cluster and field. And what we see is that if we look above 10 to the power 10 solar mass galaxies, in both of these cases, most of the red data points are above this median line, which is basically showing us at the same stellar mass, quenched galaxies are likely to have a higher Vmax peak value. So how do we connect that with the whole scenario? For that, we divide these galaxies into groups. So basically between 10 to the power 9 and 10 solar masses, we call them the low mass galaxies. And 10 to the power 10 and 11, we call them the high mass galaxies in our sample. And instead of dividing them into only the running medians, as we see here, we divide them into running quartiles. So basically in terms of Vmax peak, we divide them like in the lowest, medium, high, and very high Vmax peak value. And this is what we get. Now, there is a lot going on, but I'll try to break it down. So in the left panel, we're seeing the high mass galaxies. The right panel, we're seeing the low mass galaxies from our sample. In y-axis, we're seeing the quenched fraction. And in x-axis, we're looking at the Vmax peak quartiles. So these are all the same galaxies with same stellar mass. But this is at the same stellar mass if they have a low Vmax peak, and this is if they have a very high Vmax peak based on their distribution. And in both of these cases, the red circles are showing us the cluster satellites, and the blue triangles are showing us the field centrals. And again, for both of these cases, the larger the data point, the lower the redshift, and the smaller, the higher. Now let's focus on the low mass galaxies first. And if we look into especially the highest redshift, we see that there is basically no quenching going on for either field or clusters. So that's okay, so basically there is nothing different going on in these two environments for these low mass galaxies. But if we look at redshift 2, we already see that there is a slight enhancement of quenching in clusters already. There's about like 5% quenched galaxies. And if we look at redshift 1.5, it's again between 5 and 10. So what it's telling us that between redshift 3.5 and 2, environmental quenching already started for cluster satellites, especially for these low mass galaxies in our sample. But if you look at the distribution of these quenched galaxies with respect to their Vmax peak values, there is basically no dependence. So they're basically quenching everything. But now, if we look at the high mass sample, we see that at redshift 3.5, again, the distribution, there's some quenching happening, but the distribution of quenched galaxies in cluster and field are not very different. So whatever is quenching them is very similar. This changes very interestingly if we go at redshift 2. So again, we don't see any difference, like if you consider the error bars in the fraction, in the distribution of these lines. So the red circle again is like the cluster satellites, and the field centrals, they show that they have comparable quenched fraction with respect to their Vmax peak values, which means that for the same stellar mass, if they have a higher Vmax peak, they are more likely to be quenched. But because these distributions are very similar, what it's telling us is that whatever processes are quenching them are likely similar as well. There is no difference in the cluster satellites. Now that changes when we come to redshift 1.5. So here we already see that in clusters there is an enhancement of quenched fractions. So this is basically telling us that environmental quenching for these high mass galaxies are kicking in between redshift 2 and 1.5. It can be changed based on the simulation, etc. But just that this is when it's happening. But what is interesting is that again we see the dependence of quenched fraction with respect to the Vmax peak. And we see that even though there is an enhancement, there's still a lot of quenched galaxies that are already in the field here. And especially if we look at really high halo mass value, we see that both in cluster and field, they are similar likelihood to be quenched. Now, how does that connect with the observations we saw in GoGreen, for example, that cluster satellites already quenched at higher redshift? Is that because we see that they are probably similar processes are already quenching the cluster satellites and field centrals at this stellar mass and halo mass regime. So it doesn't really matter which environment they are in. But because we started with the fact that in cluster environment there are already a higher number of galaxies that have this high halo mass, that is basically sort of telling us in a roundabout way that in clusters they are more likely to be quenched, but not because there is excess processes happening in the cluster, but because there is just more high mass halos. So this is just to show that, to reiterate that again. But because in this conference we also care about the processes that are doing it, so of course we see that there is more galaxies with high mass halo, but why are they getting quenched? So in our attempt to look into this, we looked at different properties, and more specifically here we are looking at cluster satellites with their black hole mass, and in the middle panel we are looking at the half mass radius of in the left side cluster satellites, in the right side is at the field centrals. So what we see here is that for field centrals, most of them, actually about 85% of them, have really a massive, supermassive black hole. So great, AGNs. For cluster satellites, although there's like a good fraction of them, which is about 60% of them that also have massive AGN, but most of them really are very compact. And also for clusters, these massive galaxies that have also very massive AGNs, we found that they did not really come close to the R200 of the cluster before they quenched. So they definitely quenched quite early on. Is this because of intrinsic quenching, because of pre-processing? We really didn't get into that, but that's something we'd like to look at next. Yeah, so with that, I'll just show you the summary plot, but mainly what I'd like to reiterate is that the quenching models that have been already established for low redshift cluster environments is not what should work in the higher shift regime. And I think that listening to all the talks in the conference so far, I think the whole community actually converges into that there's definitely something different going on. Maybe the halo properties is one good way of looking at it when we reconsider this quenching mechanism. And just before I finish, I would really like to test this in observations. So if you have any idea, suggestion, criticism, please feel free to let me know. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Okay, questions. Saw Rob's hand first.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I want to ask about the last point. This joint analysis of mass versus environmental quenching looks to be very powerful. And we, of course, as discussed in many talks, though, environmental quenching could be one of many mechanisms. It's true for mass quenching as well, right? So you mentioned AGN quenching as possibly being the explanation, but there are others, star formation, I won't list them all. Do you think that this approach could actually shed some light on what the mass quenching mechanisms are, or is the environmental quenching just so separable that you have to address that question in a different way?
Thank you. I think that's, I think in your question there was already the answer in a way that we don't really see that it's very separable. But this attempt for us was really to, I think, draw the line that when we think about environmental quenching, we don't really think, we kind of tend to think that clusters in local universe are similar to clusters at higher shift universe, and this is really drawing the point that they are not the same. And whereas I think like this environmental dependence, like we clearly saw, for example, from Greg's talk or Benedetta's talk, that environmental quenching is there. We see an enhancement, but the reason they're enhanced are different, and this could be one way to look at it.
Hello. Wait, is this on? Yes. Oh. Like I said, I hate microphones. So I was curious. Everything was really cool, but what really struck my eye was the exceptions to the rules. So I was curious if you looked at any of the galaxies in the simulations. For example, you had a galaxy that was labeled as star forming at 10 to the 11 stellar mass and 1,000 kilometers per second. Is there anything to be learned from those weirdo galaxies?
You mean these ones?
Yeah, even higher up yeah. I mean, what's that guy doing? Is there anything to be learned from him?
Well, it could be different things, but also I think it's good to remember that these are coming from simulations, and we already know that the quenching in simulations, especially like they over-quench the low mass galaxies we already saw, but they also under-quench the really massive galaxies. So it could be simply because the cooling is not working very well in the simulation and they just couldn't stop forming stars. But so I would be very skeptical. We didn't look into detail in each of them, but yeah, that would be my answer. Thank you.
Thank you for a nice talk. I wonder if you checked the difference between galaxy halos dark matter profile distribution for galaxies in cluster and in field at fixed halo mass, just to check if there are some evidence of assembly bias effects.
That's a very interesting point. So I did not look into the dark matter profile of individual galaxies, but the halo mass difference that I showed, so this is coming from the hydro simulation, but I also looked at it from the dark matter only simulations. There is still, however weak, there is still the same feature, but the one for individual galaxies, that's something that would be interesting to check. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for the talk, Lammim. The good talk. So one question is related to your last point, like other observational tests. So in the simulations, do you find any correlation with Vmax and other observables, like the number of satellite galaxies, something that's measurable? We can't easily get Vmax for everything, but we could see, is there something about the clustering or the number of satellite galaxies, something that we can go to and measure? We can't necessarily identify which galaxies are going to be the progenitors of future cluster galaxies, but it seems like this phenomena happens in the field and in the clusters. So we really just need to ask, do we find this residual quenching effect with some other parameter aside from galaxy mass?
Thank you. That's a very nice pointer, I think. So what I was looking at as I was showing, like I was looking at the half mass radius, the black hole mass, the distance from the cluster center that the galaxy came, also the epoch when they first quenched. So I was looking at like a distribution of all of these properties and trying to like do multi-dimension, two-dimensional collapse using machine learning. I am trying to include more properties, so this is definitely going to be one of the more properties, but it's something for future. Yeah, thank you.
Let's thank our speaker again.
Thinking. There we go.
Okay, our next speaker is Stacy Alberts, who's going to be talking about protoclusters to clusters, the infrared view of environment going into the era of JWST.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So yeah, my name is Stacy Alberts. I'm an associate research professor at the University of Arizona. I'm also a member of the JWST MIRI team, so if you have MIRI questions, I am happy to answer them. Yeah, so I want to thank the organizers for inviting me here to talk to you about, kind of the transition from protoclusters to clusters, kind of from the perspective of infrared studies, and then going into the era of JWST. But before we get started with that, we've seen so many awesome jellyfish talks during the week that I was kind of jealous. So I had to show off this guy again. So this is ISO 137001. We've seen it a lot of times at this conference. This is the JWST MIRI image of it at 7.7 microns. So what you're seeing is dust emission, so in the galaxy, and then in all of these nice little knots and filaments out here, we're getting the dust emission associated with star formation, presumably, and those areas are also, they have H-alpha, they have CO, as we've been seeing, and so stay tuned for analysis on that. For the rest of the talk now, I'm going to talk about high redshift stuff. Okay, so actually, Benedetta and Greg did me a huge favor, and they introduced a ton of the concepts that I was going to go over, so I don't have to go into too much detail. So I'm going to go kind of quickly through my introduction. But basically, I want to focus on, this era where we have these protocluster structures that are very extended, taking a large volume on the sky, and having, a bunch of different halos with star formation and perhaps quenched populations going on, and then they, at some point around redshift 2-ish, hand wavy, they do some transition where they start to collapse, and then we eventually get down to our quenched clusters at redshift 0. So that's kind of the epoch that I want to focus on. And so, I'm gonna go through this quickly, but this is just to kind of go through and say that, from the infrared perspective, we echo a lot of things that were already said by Benedetta in her review. If you're interested in more detail, because I'm just gonna fly through this, you can check out this review that I wrote with Allison Noble a couple of years ago. And so, here we're seeing some intermediate redshift clusters, and we're looking at both. This shows both the UV and infrared star formation rates, and you can see that, we have this drop in the star forming fraction that extends out to pretty far, several times past the virial radius. And so this is kind of this idea that, we haven't caught these guys quenching in the act, and so this is probably some sort of fast quenching or maybe even pre-processing happening. But we also see, as Benedetta was saying, a suppression in these star formation rates and specific star formation rates, which indicates kind of a more slow quenching because we are catching these guys in the act. We see the corresponding atomic and molecular gas deficits, as you know, I don't need to talk about again because we've talked about that a lot. We see the morphological changes. And then, you know, if we kind of put it all together and we look at other dependencies as well, we get this picture that everything is like very complex, as we've been talking about at the conference. So over here, this is a study from Pintos Castro. They were able to look at the environmental quenching efficiency in a rather large sample. So they tried to separate out the effects of environment and stellar mass. So that's kind of what's been being shown here. And you can see, of course, that there is a stellar mass dependence, there's a redshift dependence, and then if you go and you compare to like the Planck clusters from a Vandenberg study, there's a halo mass dependence as well. And then I'm also going to throw in there AGN, we talked about radial orbits, all this stuff. So everything is pretty complicated, and we got to try and disentangle all this stuff. And that's why we're all here with jobs. So, and then of course things get even more challenging as we move towards higher redshift. We try to get to redshift 2 and where this transition is happening. We have a harder time establishing cluster membership. You know, multi-wavelength surveys, spectroscopy all get more expensive. And then, you know, one of my favorite things is that we have to start dealing with dust even more. We're moving into cosmic noon era where stuff is particularly dusty. So that's shown over here. This is the star formation rate density of the universe, so including everything, as a function of redshift. And it's split into unobscured star formation in the blue and obscured star formation in the red. And as you can see, you know, in this epoch that we're interested in and across cosmic noon, the star formation is pretty dust obscured. That's the dominant component. So we really got to worry about that and deal with a lot of red galaxies, and that just gets harder as we go to higher redshifts. This dust also obscures AGN, so we have a hard time identifying those. We get biases in optical sizes and morphologies from dust, and I'll show that a little bit later. And so, you know, dust, you gotta care about it. And then the last thing is that just to, you know, reiterate, you know, as we go to higher and higher redshifts, things get more expensive, so we're limited to more high mass populations, more luminous populations, and then also these bluer populations. So these are the things that we the biases that we kind of want to beat back. And I think with JWST we can do a lot of work. Okay, so as Greg showed in his talk, we've traced the star formation rate density relationship up to redshift 1. So redshift 1 clusters are pretty quenched. But then when we go above that, we're finding kind of this potentially mixed scenario. We find some high redshift clusters that have very quenched populations. So this is showing the quenched fraction in, you know, a couple of individual clusters at redshift 1.8, redshift 2. This is a assembly of Carla clusters, 16 clusters around radio loud AGN. And so these guys, you look at them and you say, you know, oh, the clusters are pretty well quenched, particularly the massive end, and so we would still, you know, we still see the star formation rate density relation even at these higher redshifts. But that doesn't seem to be universally true. If you fold infrared observations into it and you look at high redshift clusters, you start to see evidence that, you know, we aren't dominated by quenched populations. We have kind of a weakening of the star formation rate density relation in some clusters. So that's shown over here in the star forming fraction with MIPS detections. We can look at the total star formation rate per halo mass in these clusters and see how it evolves with time. And then over here is a study that we did of 11 clusters with deep Herschel data. So Herschel is unfortunately confusion limited to the point where, you know, you're only looking at the most star-forming galaxies, you know, even with deep Herschel observations. So what we did is we looked at the individual galaxies, saw what they were doing, but we also stacked on mass-limited cluster samples to see, you know, if you could go down, what would the average star formation kind of be? And we split our survey into two, and we find that, you know, when we go to our highest redshift clusters around redshift 1.5, we don't see this dip anymore in the specific star formation rate when we get into the cluster centers. and then it shows up again as we go down to redshift 1. And then if we do a compilation of the infrared observations in the literature, and we look at the total star formation rate per halo mass as a function of redshift. So the gray here is the field. So, it's hard to see on this plot, but clusters at low redshift are quenched, as you would imagine. But the evolution of this with redshift seems to be steeper. There's a lot of scatter there. So what's going on is there's just a lot of different scenarios for individual clusters, and of course these observations are very hard to do. But it's kind of suggesting that there's a steeper trend than the field, indicating that some clusters at least are pretty star forming at these higher redshifts. And then you can see this over here in the environmental quenching efficiency as well. This was a sample of, I forget how many clusters it was, but you can see that the environmental quenching facility efficiency drops as we go to past this kind of like redshift 1.5 epoch. Okay, so I think it's fair to say that some clusters at high redshift, of course this is going to be halo mass dependent, all sorts of stuff, can host significant star formation, and they're still actively building up their stellar populations. But so far, there's two questions in my mind. Can we have a weakening of the star formation rate density relation where we see clusters that are actively forming their populations, or do we get this enhancement like we've been talking about with RAM pressure strip galaxies? Do we get a general, like global enhancement that would actually be a reversal of the star formation rate density relation? So there is a little bit of evidence for that. There's this study from, do they pronounce it Buds? Okay, awesome, thank you. From Buds. So they were looking at, so this is more of a local galaxy density, local environment measure rather than looking at clusters, but they looked at these in different mass bins as a function of the galaxy local density, and they find that the star formation rates do, for the highest mass galaxies, maybe show this kind of reversal is happening when you go to higher redshifts. So this is kind of more in the protocluster regime than the cluster regime. This has also been seen in some simulations. So it's possible this could be happening. I think that what we need is some infrared observations to kind of confirm this, because again, we're kind of in this regime where things can be pretty dusty. I don't think I meant to put that slide there. Maybe I did. Okay, just to drive that point home, so we saw earlier some protoclusters that had quenched populations, but also we find when we look at some protoclusters that they have tons of dusty star formation going on, so thousands of solar masses forming per year, and some of these we call them dusty star forming galaxies. They're very luminous infrared galaxies. And so this is just one example where we, originally had this Loboka map of the center of this cluster, and then, we went and got ALMA observations, and you can see that these like Loboka blobs split up into many dusty star forming galaxies. So there's really a lot of mass buildup going on there. Okay, so I just have like one slide. We've talked a lot about feedback at this conference. We haven't talked a lot about just identifying AGN, which can get kind of more difficult at higher redshift. And the AGN fraction in clusters and how it changes with redshift is, to me, not really that well known, but we do know that it does increase with redshift. So the AGN fraction is heavily suppressed in local clusters and low redshift clusters, but then it rises pretty steeply to the point where we eventually kind of reach the field. And then I think we have a little bit of, this is very tentative evidence, but we looked at 22 clusters between redshifts 1.5 and 2. We identified AGN using SED fitting, so this should be able to kind of get some lightly obscured AGN as well. And then we normalized it, at a large radii and saw what the trend is. So the AGN are like the purple is AGN, and then the green is composite galaxies. Maybe that one's AGN. Yep, sorry. That one's AGN and that one's composites. And you can see that it kind of pops up there. So I don't know what's going on there. I like to think that maybe clusters could trigger AGN, but that's something that maybe JWST can really help us out with. Okay, and then we've also talked about gas at this conference a lot, so I just, again, have one slide on that. Gas is, of course, very important, both the molecular and atomic phases. Of course, with atomic gas, we have a hard time getting that at higher redshift, and then with molecular gas, and this was mentioned earlier in the week as well, we also have some issues. We have to rely on proxies like CO and dust because we can't get it directly, and so, you might wonder if our calibrations for those have any problems, and we are finding some evidence of problems. So this is looking at individual CO detections are up here in cluster galaxies at redshifts 1.5 to 2, but then when we go and we look at the dust continuum proxy for molecular gas, it seems we find a deficit. CO finds that cluster galaxies just kind of have normal field-like gas fractions, and so I think that probably what's going on there is some kind of mismatch between the calibrations that we have not figured out yet. So I think that's very important for us to solve so that we can look at the molecular gas at these redshifts and understand what we're looking at. Okay, so yeah, that was just kind of my introduction of kind of where we're at. And so in this epoch around redshift 2, I think that we have found significant star formation in some clusters that survives the collapse, so it's not all just happening in protoclusters, but other clusters at that redshift are also very quenched, so we have a mixed thing going on. And now we'll talk about what JWST can do to help. Okay, so if we bring back up our kind of list of challenges, so this is of course not exhaustive. JWST can do a lot more other things. There's a lot of things it can't do, but this is just the couple of things that I wanted to show today. So in terms of establishing cluster membership, having JWST, the near-infrared data, can really improve your photometric redshifts. We can also efficiently get near-infrared spectroscopy in a lot of ways. So I'm kind of keeping this to the idea of being able to survey some sort of area. JWST is not a survey machine, but with the imaging and the GRISM spectroscopy, we can get some sort of area. And then there's also, of course, things like near-spec spectroscopy where you can get targeted observations, but you're going to be limited in how many you can target. So I'm kind of focusing on the ones where you can actually survey a little bit. So improved redshifts. On the kind of dust side of things, we can get obscured star formation rates and AGN. We can identify obscured AGN really well up to redshifts 3 or so. So this encompasses that kind of 2 to 3 range where we want to look for kind of the transition from protoclusters to clusters. And then I'll go into that a little bit more. With near-infrared data, you can really, and the resolution of JWST, you can get improved sizes, morphologies, merger rates. You can really do a better job with that, as well as color gradients. And then, we can kind of move past some of these biased populations. We do better with red galaxies. We do better with low-mass galaxies than we were able to do before. And also higher redshifts. So that'll be really, and things like improved star formation histories. It's going to be good. Okay, so starting kind of with the cluster membership or protocluster membership, we saw this plot already. So this is a protocluster at redshift about 8, identified by the GLASS team with near-spec spectroscopy. So the near-spec multiplexing can be really nice if you have a target sample that's high density. So that's kind of, you can get this kind of thing. And then over here on the right, we have, so this is our JADE survey in the Good South field. So using photometric redshifts, we identified an overdensity at redshift 5 or so. So that's these cyan points here. And then we went and confirmed many of them with the NIRCam GRISM spectroscopy. So this is slitless spectroscopy from the Fresco team. And so, it's kind of a really nice way to identify overdensities, and at redshift 5, kind of a new territory thing. For our photometric redshifts, we have something like 15 to 19 bands of photometry going down to like 29 to 30 magnitude. So the photo-Z's are really good. And then, of course, the slitless spectroscopy gets us like the O3 line or the H-alpha line pretty easily, pretty efficiently. A follow-up study to this found even more overdensities between redshifts of 5 and 9 or so, a total of 17, I believe, between Good South and Goods North. So that's throwing me a little bit, how we're finding all these overdensities in these tiny fields, because this is not a large area. So that, I think, means, to me, that means that we need to think about redefining how we define overdensities. But that's a whole different talk, I think. So I think the takeaway from this is that, you know, if we can do this at redshifts 5 and above, the improved photo-Zs and the efficient, you know, slitless spectroscopy can really help us do cluster membership and protocluster membership back down in the cosmic noon regime, where we would be, you know, interested in studying the transition. And then also we can start to look at group membership as well, I think, in a kind of robust way. Okay. Now I'm going to switch over to obscured star formation rates. So obscured star formation rates, we can get them in the, you know, we've gotten them in the far infrared before, but we can also get them in the mid-infrared. We did so with Spitzer. So the way this works is that in the mid-infrared, you have this really complicated spectrum of dust features, very broad dust features that dominate there. And if you are on one of those dust features or the mid-infrared continuum, we've shown that at least in massive galaxies, that is a good proxy for the obscured star formation rate. So with MIRI, we do even better, because with Spitzer, we had this big gap between 18 and 24 microns. With MIRI, we have 9 bands between 5 and 25 microns. So you can see that here. This is at, you know, low redshift. We're covering like all the PA features, so we can do a really good job in characterizing those. Sorry, did I say PAs earlier? PAs are PAs are the grains that are causing these dust features here. And then up to redshift 2, which is what we've been interested in so far in this talk, we still cover 1 or 2 of the major dust features, and so we can get a good star formation rate from that. And so we've been showing this with our survey SMILES, which is also in the Good South field on top of JADES. Okay, but you might wonder if it works. I mean, we've shown it works with massive galaxies, but, you know, we could already do it with massive galaxies. Can we do this at cosmic noon with MIRI? And this is work in progress, but it turns out, yeah, thank you. Probably, yeah, really well. Another nice thing that JWST opens up for us is access to the Passion alpha and Passion beta lines, which are near-infrared lines tracing star formation, and because they're near-infrared lines, they are very robust against dust extinction. And so what we've been doing is we've been comparing the star formation rates that we would derive from MIRI, both MIRI alone, and then, you know, our typical, combine it with the UV to get the total, as a function of the star formation rates we get from Passion alpha. And as you can see, it works pretty well, down to star formation rates of about 1 solar mass per year or so, down to masses of about 10 to the 9. So we can push this pretty far and get a really good census of star formation in kind of this cosmic noon transition epoch. Okay, and then just to comment, people have been taking advantage of this Passion alpha and Passion beta coverage. You can do it either with near-cam GRISM slitless spectroscopy, and so you could get coverage of a protocluster region, or you can do it with the medium or the narrow bands. So I have one program to do it for a cluster at redshift 1.3 with the medium bands, and then the spider web cluster is being covered with a narrow band. So dusty star formation is not the only type of like red galaxy that we kind of improve things, improve how we can handle them. So this is a study I did last year. It didn't start out as an environment study, actually. It started out as just, we have this ultra deep MIRI parallel in JADES, 46 hours in 7.7 microns per pointing over a small area. And so at redshifts 3 to 5 or so, that's J-band. So you get your UVJ, and I wanted to see if we could go find high redshift quiescent galaxies and how well, you know, how much the MIRI data was adding to our being able to do that. So as a side effect of that, we identified a bunch of low mass post-starburst galaxies at redshifts 3 to 6, or 3 to 5. And I was like, oh, that's really cool. Low mass post-starburst, okay. And then we started looking at them, and a bunch of them were around this thing that we looked, we found this like the first day we got our data. We're like, wow, that's pretty. We call it the cosmic rose, right? So it turns out the cosmic rose is at redshift 3.7. It's a dusty star-forming galaxy and a massive quenched galaxy, so it's one of these Jekyll and Hyde pairs. And then it just turns out that there's like 3 other low-mass quenched galaxies around it. One is unrelated. So I was like, oh, well, that's cool. And then we went and we looked in general, and we looked at all of the low-mass post-starbursts that we found, and they're all located in an overdensity. So this is not definitive, of course. Yeah, thanks. But the idea that low-mass galaxies quench preferentially in environment is something that I've wanted to test for a really long time. I didn't expect to be looking at it at redshift 3.7. So this is something that I hope people follow up and we find some interesting things. For sizes and morphologies, of course, NIRCam just provides really good resolution. So just real quick, you can compare the HST resolution to the corresponding NIRCam band. It's already much better, and then we get lots more bands in the near infrared. And then to bring this back to dust, as I always do, we're finding that if you compare the 4 micron sizes to the 1.6 micron sizes that we've been using, getting from HST for all this time, it's not flat. There's a trend here, and that's because the dust makes you overestimate the size if you're not in the near infrared regime. So that'll help a lot with our ability to understand the sizes and morphologies of cluster galaxies. Yeah, and then this is my last slide. And then, there's a lot more that we can do with it now that we can do spatially resolved near-infrared studies. So this over here is a dusty galaxy at redshift 2.7. The galaxy itself, the main disk has been subtracted out, and what we find is that residual in the NIRCam, there's 2, the second one's kind of hard to see, but there's 2 ridges, very large ridges, so a little bit bigger than the old UV clumps that we used to on the kiloparsec size. Now they're smaller apparently, which is cool. But we find these big ridges, and then they correspond to ALMA detections as well. So there seem to be these star-forming structures that are dust obscured, so we wouldn't have found them before. It would be really hard. And then a bunch of gas there. So we're trying to get more high-resolution CO data to try and figure that out. In the middle here, we see some examples of color gradients that we can do with NIRCam. Yeah, the last part. And so you can see that we like to look for outside-in or inside-out quenching. Well, with the color gradients, we can do a really good job of kind of seeing where we have kind of more red cores surrounded by blue disks, or kind of red disks. Things are lopsided. We can do all sorts of fun spatially resolved stuff. And then just this last thing over here, one of the people in Jade's, Rensis, she took our sample of massive elliptical galaxies, went to them, she subtracted out the elliptical galaxy and identified small galaxies around them. I don't know if you can see these like green points, but there's about 20 tiny galaxies around this massive elliptical. And we're getting, their mass ratios of 1,000 to 1. So this is 100 times better than HST could do. We're basically finding all these little things that if they merged with this elliptical, they would be about 30% of its mass. So they could be, they could be responsible for ellipticals being puffed up and building up their mass after they quench in the local universe. So that's just a taste of what, is happening with JWST now. At these really high redshifts, which I didn't even really talk about, we're finding a bunch of overdensities that we now have to understand. And then in this transition epoch around cosmic noon, I think we can make a lot of progress with pretty efficient observing, because JWST is pretty powerful at cosmic noon. So thank you.
Thanks. That's really exciting. Questions? I saw all the way.
Thank you very much for a nice review. I have a question about the IGN fraction in clusters. You've shown this trend of increasing IGN fraction with redshift, And I was just wondering if this high redshift cluster are the same mass as the low redshift cluster in this sample, because we know that the AGN fraction does depend very strongly on the velocity dispersion. So it's higher for groups than for clusters. So if you're comparing, high redshift clusters, there might be a low mass system.
Yeah. So these particular plots are all from clusters in the Booties survey. And those clusters, because of the way they were selected, are all basically the same mass. So it's a terrible progenitor sample, but it is like kind of fixed in halo mass. So yeah, that's been accounted for here. If we went and then compared to very low redshifts, numbers, then we would have to control for that. And I don't remember if we looked at that all this time ago, but in this particular case, yeah, that's kind of controlled for.
Thanks. There's a lot here. Could you? This is awesome. Could you go to the part where you mentioned the quenched dwarf or quenched low mass galaxies in overdense regions?
With my rows, yeah.
Right. So this is really interesting. We heard a few times this week about the so-called cosmic web stripping or cosmic web quenching. We actually had a paper led by Imad Pasha specifically targeting redshift 3 to 5. Cosmic web quenching in overdense regions due to virial shock heating of cosmic web structures, not of individual halos. Have you considered, is there a way to maybe use this sample to kind of test these models?
Yeah, there is, and nobody tell anybody this. I regret I don't have the picture, but we have a lot of medium band coverage over this region now, and in some of the medium bands where there are emission lines, there's like a bunch of diffuse emission around this, and we haven't analyzed it yet, but like there's some wide-reaching environmental something happening around this rose that might be related to what you're talking about. Yeah, don't tell anybody. I'm being recorded, aren't I?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
I'm in so much trouble.
I won't tell anybody, I promise. So can you go to the plot with the color gradients that you showed?
The last one?
Yeah, that one.
I didn't do this
No, not
work.
that one, the one with
Oh.
the plot of the 444, yeah, that one.
Yeah.
So even for the quiescent galaxies, you're finding that they're significantly smaller in 4.4 microns and 1.5. So you said it was increasing dust.
Yeah, for the star-forming galaxies, it definitely is. The quiescent galaxies, you think that's a strong trend? It kind of looks like it's...
I guess I don't know statistically if at the intermediate redshift bin, the 1.5 to 2 bin, if there's, it looks like there's a trend there, but it's hard to...
Yeah. So one of the things that we're finding when we look at, and not just us, everybody who's looking at UVJ stuff, is at high redshift is there's a certain part of UVJ space at high redshift that, the galaxies won't sit there because they're not old enough yet. The universe isn't old enough for them to sit there. So when we find them there, we think that they're probably dusty in some way, and that is borne out by SED fitting. Where'd my plot go? Yeah, like that guy way up there, kind of on the edge. Okay. So that needs to be investigated, whether these elliptical galaxies can have some dust in them. I think they can, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Let's thank our speaker again.
Come on. Stay with me.
Okay, our next speaker is Jillian Wilson, and she'll be telling us about the magazine survey.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jillian Wilson. I'm a professor at the University of California, Merced. Merced is less than 20 years old. We are the 10th university in the University of California system, and our buildings haven't started to lean, not yet anyway. Okay, so I want to thank the organizers for a wonderful conference, and of course my fellow participants, for lots of stimulating dialogue. I'm going to be telling you in the next few minutes about the massive ancient galaxies at redshift greater than 3 near-infrared survey, or magazine for short. And that's a survey of ultramassive galaxies and their environments. Most of the work's been done at Keck. In particular, I'm going to be focusing on results, some work done by my former postdoc, Ben Forrest, who is now at UC Davis, and my former graduate student. He just defended a couple months ago, and he'll be off to University of Wisconsin-Madison for a postdoctoral fellowship in the fall. Okay, so the magazine survey, it's a sample of photometrically selected ultramassive galaxies, and they are selected to have a photometric stellar mass above 10 to the 11 and to lie at photometric redshift between 3 and 4. They're selected from catalogs which have deep near IR data in the ultravista and video fields. And because we've got up to 50 band passes between 0.3 and 8 microns, that means that we have pretty good high-quality photometric redshifts and SED fitting. So you see the sample here in UVJ space, and we actually split our survey into 2 phases. Phase 1 was those galaxies you see there in purple. They're lying in the blue part of the UVJ diagram, and that was deliberate. We wanted to go after some of a sample that was less likely to be contaminated by dust or by AGN, and we thought we'd be more likely to get spectroscopic redshifts for those galaxies. So here's how we did. We actually managed to confirm 16 of those targets. We got spectroscopic redshifts, and if you look in the 3rd column, let's see which is there we go. If you look in this column, the spectroscopic redshifts that we got were actually pretty good, pretty close to the photometric estimates. And the stellar masses were also pretty accurate, pretty close to the photometric stellar mass estimates. Here I've plotted those 16 spectroscopically confirmed UMGs, but this time they're cut in UVJ space, but this time they're colored by specific star formation rate, with blue most active and red least active. And if you look at this one with the green circle, it's in the star-forming part of the UVJ diagram. It's SED, is here on the left, and it's K-band spectrum on the right. And you can see the O3 doublet and the H-beta emission line there for that galaxy. And now I'll show a post-starburst example. This middle galaxy here, again in the green circle. It's SED on the left, and we had H as well as K-band spectra for this one. And so you see H-beta, but this time not in emission, in absorption. Okay. So on this slide, what we've plotted here is, again, our sample of 16 plus some others from the sample of Schreiber and Valentino. Ours are blue and red, as in the previous diagram. What we plotted here is the redshift at which the UMG had formed 50% of its stellar mass. That's on the left. And on the right, you see the redshift at which the star formation rate fell below 10% of the average peak star formation rate during the main epoch of star formation. And a pretty coherent picture is now starting to emerge about this sample. These ultramassive galaxies undergo vigorous bursts of star formation between about redshift 4 and 6, followed by a period of rapid quenching within about the last 350 million years. So here I have plotted the star formation rate against stellar mass, and the cyan points you see is the mean star formation rate calculated from the ultravista sample. And you can see that our ultramassive galaxies most of them are falling below the main star-forming main sequence, many by as much as a dex or so. Now, if you look at this point here, this is our most quiescent member of the sample. And here again, on the left, spectral energy distribution, and on the right, the H and K-band Keck spectra. This one was so interesting that Ben actually wrote a whole paper about it. So we looked at this most quiescent member of our sample, and here it is. So the black, this is the UMG that we were studying. Here are some others known from the literature. The colored points are star formation, estimated in different ways, and the black points are galaxies from the TNG 300 simulation. And so this is interesting. There's a couple of points to take away from this. First of all, simulations are able to produce galaxies of this stellar mass, so it's not really a problem to be able to form galaxies with stellar mass above 10 to the 11 or so. But if you look at the simulations, none of them really have any galaxies that are quite as quenched as this one that we had discovered. And so this is perhaps evidence of insufficiently rapid quenching mechanisms in the simulations. We'll see. As we get more galaxies, we'll see where we are. But that one was an interesting one, and as I said, Ben wrote an entire paper about it. Okay, so if I take you back to our sample again, I've talked about the targets we followed up in phase 1. Now I'm going to talk about the targets here in orange that we followed up in phase 2. And these are the redder galaxies, potentially dustier galaxies, potentially a galaxy with AGN. So let me plot those for you as a function of stellar mass. And remember, these are photometrically estimated stellar masses. These are they have photometric stellar masses above 10 to the 11 and redshifts between 3 and 4. But you can immediately see that the second part of the sample have potentially much higher stellar masses than phase 1 of the survey. So they are candidates that we dubbed super ultramassive galaxies. And we set out with Keck to see if we could get spectroscopic confirmation of those targets. So how did we do? Well, these were a rather mixed bag, it turned out. So we targeted 16 super ultramassive galaxies, 15 with MOSFIRE and 1 with NIRES. And of those 16, we managed to get 12 spectroscopic redshifts. 8 of them were heavily dust obscured. I'll show you 3 examples. So those are 3 examples of this set of 8. Heavily dust obscured massive star-forming galaxies between redshift 2 and 2.7. So a little bit lower redshift than the photometric redshift. And some of them showed broad features indicative of AGN. 3, and I'll show 2 examples of that here, those 2. 3 turned out to be broad-line AGN hosts between redshift 3 and 4. So the redshift was correct, but we had broad-line AGN hosts, and when we subtracted the flux due to the AGN, the stellar mass of those targets was not a super ultramassive galaxy. They fell into the range of ultramassive galaxies. One, which I haven't shown here, was a redshift 1.2 dusty galaxy. And so the bottom line was, of that entire sample of 16, none of them actually turned out to be a super ultramassive galaxy at redshift 3 to 4. So what I've done here is plotted, remember phase 1 is purple, phase 2 is orange. I've plotted a comparison of the properties of those galaxies with and without spectroscopic information. And you see on the top left redshift, top right stellar mass, dust attenuation, and again the rest frame UVJ color, but now calculated for the galaxy at its correct spectroscopic redshift. And you'll notice that for the orange sample, so things line up pretty well for the purple sample. Those UVJ blue galaxies, things line up pretty well in redshift and stellar mass. They don't have very much dust. That's a pretty clear agreement between the spectroscopic and photometric properties. But for the orange sample, things are quite different. There's quite a bit of disagreement. And in particular, if you look at the redshift, none of the phase 2 galaxies, their spectroscopic redshifts, none of them fell within a delta Z of 0.5 of their photometric redshifts. And this has rather important implications for the galaxy number density. So we'll look at that next. So on the left, you see galaxy number density for galaxies above a stellar mass of 10 to the 11. And on the right, same thing, but for galaxies above a stellar mass of 11.7. And the colored lines are predictions from simulations, and the colored symbols are observations from various different groups, including ours shown there in red. So for this on the left, there's good agreement, but for the high mass end of the number density, the number density plot, there's actually been a lot of disagreement, and that's been known for a while. The observations seem to very much get a higher number of galaxies at that high mass end than the simulations did, and that's been referred to as the impossibly early galaxy problem. How can we form so many of these high mass galaxies when the universe is still quite young, was the question. And it looks like that our work is showing a potential resolution here in that because we discovered red interlopers and we were able to show that those were not at the same redshift as one might photometrically have imagined and the same stellar mass, we're actually bringing down the observations with the spectroscopic program that we carried out into more agreement with the simulations. And so it's looking like many of the observational targets, the photometrically identified targets that were in that number density plot, may in fact be something else, some other kind of galaxy, either not at the redshift it was predicted photometrically, or of lower stellar mass than you would expect just from the photometric calculations. So possible resolution of the impossibly early galaxy problem there. Okay, in the last couple of slides, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the work of my graduate student. I'll remind you that a magazine is a survey of ultramassive galaxies and their property. It is not in any way a protocluster survey. But one of those properties, as well as star formation rate and all that other good stuff that you might like to study about these ultramassive galaxies, is their environment. And we have found at least 3 ultramassive galaxies to lie in overdense environments. You see 2 here, one on the left, a magazine J1000 at redshift 3.35 with 20 members, and one here on the right, magazine J0959 at redshift 3.37 with 38 members. And here is a third one in Ian's paper, which is now submitted, at redshift 3.12 with a whopping 30 members, sorry, a whopping 80 members. And although this is a small sample, it's just 3 systems, we found something quite interesting. We found evidence for galactic conformity, the first evidence, I think, for galactic conformity in redshift greater than 3 protoclusters. So what I mean by conformity, if you remember, rest frame colors of massive members near UVJ star-forming UMGs. So we've got 2 UVJ star-forming UMGs shown there in blue and green, or 2 systems with star-forming UMGs. Their members tend to be UVJ star-forming. And in contrast, those near the UVJ quiescent UMG, which is shown there in red, tend to be UVJ quiescent. So this is evidence for galactic conformity here now above redshift 3 in these protoclusters that we've discovered in the magazine survey. So that's it. I've summarized the discoveries, the titles of the discoveries that have come out of this survey so far, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks for that summary. Questions?
Very interesting. I was wondering if there was, when you compare the results from the photometric redshift with the updated spectroscopy redshift, if there was any peculiar feature in the spectra that was, let's say, the key point for correcting the redshift, or if it was just an overall improvement from photometry to spectra.
So that's an excellent question, and actually Ben's paper, this one, goes in quite a bit of effort discussing this. Why were these redshifts photometrically estimated not as precise as they could be? The answer is that we think it's to do with the models, actually. None of remember, these are taken from fields that have a large amount of photometric observations. We think it's that the models themselves just aren't able to take account of we need better estimates. We need better templates for these red galaxies. It's a combination of things. Some of them are dusty, some of them have AGN, some of them have a combination of these things. We actually think the templates just aren't doing the job, and Ben's paper goes into this in quite a bit of detail. We compare with the Cosmos photometric catalogs as well as our own internally made catalogs, and we show that none of them work very well. None of them get the redshifts right, and in fact they're quite discrepant even for the same object amongst the different catalogs.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, just following up on that. You don't have any narrow bands, and that could fix maybe the issue. No?
I think there are some so it's Cosmo, it's Ultra Vista observations. So, I mean, it might help a little, but I don't think it would help greatly. These are optical near IR observations, and I don't think they would make much improvement. I think it's the templates that we need to look at in more detail. We need to better understand how galaxies evolve. In particular, this sample of very red galaxies, the templates just aren't doing a very good job. The predictions aren't doing a very good job.
Thank you.
All right, I think we better thank our speaker.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so our next speaker is Max Kurzner, who is going to be talking about the structure and environment of Virgo cluster galaxies with deep optical morphologies.
All right, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Max Kurzner. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Victoria, where, along with Pat Cote and the rest of the NGVS team, I'm interested in studying galaxy formation evolution through galaxy morphology, which I think, as is seen across this conference, I think ties together a lot of our interests. And I'm going to tell you about some upcoming work on optical morphologies from the Virgo cluster, which will be able to really constrain morphologies like we've never seen before for work at high and low redshift, especially in the era of upcoming surveys. So before I begin, I just want to do a quick introduction on the next generation Virgo cluster survey. The NGVS was a very deep megacam program on the Canada-France-Hawaii telescope. Particularly in this work, I'm using the optical colors and magnitudes, where I'd like to highlight for you in that table that we get down to a point source depth of about 26 in G, and we're able to measure the properties of almost 4,000 member galaxies in the Virgo cluster across about 7 decades of stellar mass, which is quite exciting as we're able to study the morphologies, properties, and really basically anything you're interested in a galaxy of galaxies such as UFDs and UCDs, which you really usually only see in the local group. And here's the table I was talking about. I got ahead of myself, but as you can see now, the U, G, and I exposures and depths are what are particularly interesting to me in this work. Carrying on in terms of how great the NGVS was, we had excellent seeing on Mauna Kea, as you can see here, so we're able to get some really fine detail on our images and morphologies. And the NGVS itself has been published in 2012 with the first paper. We've had over 50 science results using NGVS data since. If you're interested, you can check out the website, or you could ask me about some in your particular field of interest if you'd like to chat. But one thing I realize I have not motivated yet is, why is the NGVS still relevant now, and what can it tell us about galaxy evolution today and galaxy morphology? And what that really is, and why I want to show you some of my work, is that it's going to be able to show us an unprecedented view of really low mass and low surface brightness galaxies in cluster environments that we can use as a probe of these high redshift protoclusters and things we were never able to see beyond Virgo, as well as the detail and morphologies I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today can tell us more physically motivated things about galaxies and tune our models and predictions before we let them loose on the upcoming surveys and current surveys like Euclid and LSST, where we're going to have millions of galaxies to learn all about. So in this work, I use the NGVS catalog. I have colors and magnitudes and things that are standard, as well as non-parametric morphologies. But one thing that we introduce in this work that is quite useful is a new classification scheme, which you know is the NGVS classification scheme, which has 2 parts, a structure code, a star formation code, and then some subcodes that I'll tell you about in a second. You can see here our structure morphological sequence goes from ellipticals through spirals, where we have a transition type that we call as ES, that would be more classically referred to as S0 or lenticular. And then galaxies that have an I after them are those undergoing strong irregular interactions due to the cluster, and ones that are going with the strongest tidal and merger features are quite rare. They do have there's a symbol as well, but there's only a handful, so I didn't include them here. But you can see that we have a broad transition sequence in morphology that was really set out to be agnostic in stellar mass as much as possible. As we know, visual morphologies do come with some bias baked in. The next broad component of the visual morphology is the star formation code, where you look at the galaxy visually and you can see, are there any stars forming? Is it quiescent? Is it forming a lot of stars, or somewhere in the middle? And additionally, while we do have nuclear star clusters fit automatically, we do go ahead and note their presence if they're in the images as well with a structural subcode. So that's a lot of information. Let's just show an example. So here is a lovely spiral galaxy from our sample, which is morphology would be as follows. So just follow along for a second. In yellow, you have it's a spiral galaxy based on its broad shape, and you see the presence of spiral arms. It is some blue going on, so there is some star formation, but not as vigorous as some of the more extreme examples of galaxies we see in clusters undergoing extreme interactions. And then everything there in parentheses are subcodes, where we say in this case it has a nucleus, there's a disk, There might be a bulge, it's tough to tell visually, and then there's spiral arms, shells, dust lanes, as well as star formation happening globally and in the disk. And in terms of a feature of note, if you think about it, we probably have it for a galaxy in the catalog, and these will be published in the work for all the galaxies we've observed in the NGVS. So just to show you more broadly, here is what this looks like at high mass, thank you, where you see the quiescent galaxies on top going down to some more star forming on the bottom, going from elliptical over to spiral, and some of the more regular morphologies on the right. Where there's a black X means that either we didn't have that galaxy in our sample or it's not physical, such as an active elliptical galaxy, and though some of the details may be hard to read here, just want to show the broad agreement we see and how these morphologies evolve as you'd expect. But what's really cool and exciting is that when we go to low mass, these same categories actually apply quite well. And while there are physically motivated differences between these galaxies, it was important to us to actually classify these galaxies with one broad sequence, as you can see here, where we're able to populate more of like the irregular and strange low mass end of our galaxy luminosity function. So from this, we can readily go ahead and make a morphology density relation. So here I'm just showing you the NGVS footprint in red, in gray. The red are just the virial radii of M87 and M49 for reference, where you can see on the left side of the screen all the structure codes overplotted, and on the right, the star formation codes. So then from there, you can bin what these look like in terms of Virgo-centric radius, and you recover a gentle but significant trend in morphology density as expected, where the more early type galaxies are found preferentially towards the center, where they've been quenched, and the more vigorously star-forming morphologies are found in higher amounts as you go to increasing radii away from the center. Not only can we parameterize things such as the morphology density relation, we can go ahead and look at the color magnitude diagram and fit power laws or whatever we wish to parameterize where certain types of galaxies are preferentially going to be found, which while in the low redshift universe this is quite simple, one can imagine being able to define areas of color and magnitude space or in a color diagram where you could statistically draw and say some confidence that certain types of galaxies will live there in your cluster environments if they're similar to Virgo or another local cluster in our universe. Now, in the remaining few minutes, I'm going to talk to you about some other exciting results from the work, where since we have morphologies for all the galaxies in the cluster, we can break out some of these galaxies into interesting subpopulations. I'm just showing an image here of, I guess, a famous case. This is a dwarf-dwarf merger, which we talk about in the work. But what I'll show you today is how we can select a selection of compact galaxies in the sample. But as you can see here, all these other types will be reported on separately in tables where we can discuss the physics of what's actually affecting these unique cluster populations. So to find compact galaxies, we can fit the size magnitude relation here, where I've clipped everything that's high mass out of this just to get rid of some of the more extreme outliers. And if you just fit a polynomial and look at your outliers, what you'll see is that things that are really quite large for their magnitude are indeed, thank you, ultra diffuse, and things that are quite compact live in the opposite end there, as you can see in the bottom of the diagram. And I did promise that we did have non-parametric morphologies. While we are not able to exactly separate out the compact galaxies from the rest of the population here, you can see in gray that we have the whole separation, so the whole cluster in Gini M20 space. You can see that preferentially, ignoring some of the strange outliers that may have at this moment gone through our cleaning process undetected, these galaxies are living preferentially in an area parameter space that galaxies that have a lot of bright light concentrated in very small portions of their galaxy is where you're most likely to find these galaxies, which was an important confirmation that these visual morphologies are what physically motivated, and the non-parametric morphologies do confirm this and allow us to back this up in a new region of parameter space itself. And now just to show you a little teaser what these look like, I just selected a sample of a couple of these compact galaxies from our sample where I've thrown their NGVS morphology there, but you can see these things are quite compact and in some cases are blue, some cases are red. We think that this is actually two separate subpopulations such as M32 dwarfs or blue compact galaxies inhabiting this part of parameter space. So this work is nearing completion. I'm still in the process of tabulating these tables, and reporting more on these morphology types of interest, and am happy to report that soon we'll have the full table, including non-parametric morphologies and the NGVS catalog for you to look at. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Questions?
You mentioned interacting dwarfs. You haven't shown much about it, but I was wondering whether you can say anything about how frequent they are and whether you think this is implications for their evolution within Virgo.
So in terms of the implication of like dwarf-dwarf mergers and interactions, what we have so far is the number of close and interacting pairs as a function of local density. We're able to relate that to, like, I guess, their density like in the XY plane, but I don't have it yet as a full, I guess, statistical sample of how this affects their evolutionary tracks. I think that VCC 848 paper goes into that in a little more detail, as well as some other works on specific dwarf evolutionary sequences, such as ultra-compact dwarfs, but it's a good question to talk more about the dwarf galaxy regime in the cluster, so thank you.
So I wanted to ask you a technicality, which is how many bands do you need for a classification method to work? Or better, can it scale with the amount of bands that you have?
So it's good. It could scale. The particular method I use here to kind of glossed over is that we look at the G-band science images and then the U-I, or UG and I color images. Scaling this to other bands would be possible, but in terms of the NGVS, those are the deepest bands and kind of trace the broad optical morphology. But there has been discussions on how this could work for other clusters, and obviously at higher redshifts, though.
Thanks.
This is a great data set. So what are your plans with this? Are you going to try to map kind of your different morphologies in phase space or local density, or what?
I guess the answer is kind of all of the above. There's been some works that have mapped some of this in distance space. There was a recent paper in the archive where we have 300 SPF measurements, distances to the cluster, where you can measure how these things actually vary in 3D space, but looking where the morphologies vary in phase space, such as local density, and a whole catalog is going to be soon published in our catalog paper. So I guess throwing the whole kitchen sink at it.
I think that's the way you guys yes. Start. Great. Thank you very much. Okay, so our next speaker is Anisha Harshan, who will be talking about the beginning of the end for massive cluster galaxies at redshift of about 2.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, organizers, for the opportunity and the wonderful conference. My name is Anisha Harshan. I'm a postdoc at the University of Ljubljana, but most of this work was done as part of my PhD thesis that was done at UNSW Sydney with Tran and Anshul Gupta and the members of the FIRE and TNG team. So I titled this talk as Beginning of the End for Massive Protocluster Galaxies at Redshift of 2 and why environment matters. But for the purposes of this conference, I think I should emphasize on the fact that we're talking about gas and why gas and environment and gas in environment matters. I think now we are convinced that galaxies in clusters and protoclusters are being affected by environment. The star formation in them is being affected by environment. So I'll skip this slide and go right on to the data that we are using. So we are using the ZForge survey, this protocluster that was first identified in the Cosmos field using the ZForge survey. It's a Virgo-like cluster. That means at redshift of 0, it is going to be around the mass of the Virgo cluster. And this protocluster in particular was also spectroscopically confirmed with the Z-Fire survey, which was a MOS-Fire spectroscopic survey using Keck, of course. So because ZForge with ZForge we also have the medium bands in H and K bands. So that means at redshift of 2, for these galaxies, we have a very fine sampling of the spectral features like D4000, which gives us fantastic redshifts as well as a good handle on the stellar population of the galaxies. But for this work, we are going to only take galaxies that are spectroscopically confirmed, and all of the analysis has been done with things that we have spectroscopy for. So with these Z4 observations, as well as because of the fact that this is in Cosmos, we have 37 bands across a large wavelength coverage, and we can use that to construct the star formation histories of these galaxies, for which I use the code called Prospector. So I divide the galaxies into the cluster and field galaxies that were spectroscopically confirmed to be cluster and field. I divide these galaxies into 4 stellar mass bins. As you go from top right to bottom left, the stellar mass bins are increasing. The cluster galaxies are shown in red, and the field galaxies are shown in blue. So as we go from the top right, that is the lowest stellar mass bin, the star formation history of the cluster galaxies is quite similar to the field galaxies. And they're experiencing recent star formation, so the star formation histories are rising. But as you go further along these stellar mass bins, the star formation histories, while they are still similar between cluster and field, they go on to bursty. And also, and only in the most massive bin do we see that there is a difference in the star formation histories of protocluster and field galaxies. So we see that the protocluster galaxies that are again shown in the solid red in the most massive bin has a flat star formation history or even a declining star formation history, whereas the field galaxies in the most massive bin still has a slightly more rising or a bursty star formation history. Now, it is to note that these galaxies, because they are spectroscopically selected, they were actually H-alpha selected, so these are not, this sample does not have any quenched galaxies. So this is only star-forming galaxies at redshift of 2. So that means that we are perhaps missing out some of the quenched galaxies in the sample, in particular in the most lowest mass bin. So now that we have the star formation histories from observations, I go on to use illustrious TNG to look at the star formation histories of the similar sample with simulations. And to do that, to do the apples to apples comparison, I do the same SFR and star formation cuts and get the star formation histories in the same stellar mass bins. And from there, we see that the star formation histories from observations are at least qualitatively similar to the star formation histories from cosmological simulations, although they are not exactly qualitatively agreeing. But we do see again that the star formation histories of, as we go from the lowest stellar mass bin to highest stellar mass bin, the star formation history go from rising to declining in the protocluster environment, whereas for field galaxies, the star formation histories are showing still some star formation is happening. It's not quite declining in the most massive bin. So now that we have our observational star formation histories are comparable to the simulations, we can use illustrious TNG to understand the physical processes that are affecting the star formation histories. And to do that, we look at multiple different properties of these galaxies. One of the things we look at is the ages of the galaxies, because we are seeing most of the effect of environment or in star formation suppression is in the most massive bin. We need to answer the question if these galaxies simply were formed earlier, and so they are evolving and quenching earlier. And it is true that we do see, so now the y-axis is the mass-weighted stellar ages. So we do see that the massive galaxies did form earlier, but the difference between the stellar ages in the most massive bin is not significant enough. So the most massive galaxies in the protocluster, they did not form significantly earlier compared to their field counterparts. So we go ahead and look at some of the other environmental processes that could affect the star formation histories of these galaxies. And one of the things we look at is mergers. So what is now shown is the distribution of total major and minor mergers that these galaxies will experience until the redshift of 2 in their histories. And we see again not a lot of significant difference between the total number of mergers that these galaxies have experienced in protocluster and field environment, at least until redshift of 2. We also look at other properties, but really the property where we see a significant difference is the gas fraction of the progenitors. So right now what we are plotting is the total gas fraction of the progenitors. So that's just all of the gas that is present in the history of all of the progenitors that make the galaxy at redshift of 2. And we have essentially plotted the history of total gas fractions in these galaxies. And as we go along in the stellar mass bin, we see that the difference between the field and clusters is starting to diverge. And we see that for the most massive bin, the protocluster galaxies have had lower gas fractions in their progenitors as early as 1 gigayear of the universe. And now that's around redshift 4 or 5. So that's a time when universe is super dense. It has a lot of galaxies, gas in them. So we need to answer the question why gas fractions in these galaxies have been much lower that early on. So to do that, we go on further to look at, so there are various mechanisms, I must say, that can lower the gas fraction in these galaxies. Either you can throw away the gas from these galaxies through outflows or AGNs or other, absolutely like ramp pressure stripping. But other thing is that these galaxies simply are not able to accrete any more gas into the stellar disks and form stars. So we are looking at mainly at the gas inflows of these galaxies in protocluster and field environments. And to do that, we are looking at a 5 kiloparsec shell around 10 half stellar mass, half radius, stellar radii, and at about 25 kiloparsec from the center of the galaxy. We do that by taking all of the gas that is infalling into the galaxy. So the influx can have either primordial gas accretion or mergers, and we are not differentiating between different kinds of gas or anything. It's just the total amount of gas that is going near the galaxy's stellar disk that will be available for the galaxy to form stars and further. So we do this again for the history of these galaxies. And again, what we get is the history of gas inflow rates. So now we took the same sample that was in the most stellar mass bin, highest stellar mass bin, and we are now dividing that sample into centrals and satellites, because for inflow rates, centrals and satellites are two completely different beasts. So now we have 4 subsamples, so cluster centrals, field centrals, field satellites, and cluster satellites. We go on further and do a stellar mass matching of the last 3 sample sets, and we cannot do that for the cluster centrals because they are simply too massive, so there is no counterparts for them. So now what we have is the gas inflow rate histories, and we see that for the cluster central, the gas inflow rates are much higher compared to their field counterparts. But if you look at the shape of the gas inflow rates, the field centrals and the field satellites have a similar shape as that of the cluster centrals, however with a lower normalization, of course. What the difference really is in the cluster satellites, which have a higher gas inflow rates compared to their field counterparts, but there is a rapid decline in gas inflow rates around redshift 4 and 5, which is around when we see the total gas fractions going down as well. So we go on further to look at what is causing this the decline in gas inflow rates, and we look at when that it starts to change. So now we have plotted the gas inflow rates before and after inflow into the galaxy halo that it was part of at redshift of 2. So as galaxies are falling into the cluster, so which is the right-hand side plot, we can see that as they are right before the inflow, the gas inflow rates is actually higher than their field centrals. However, as soon as it comes into the galaxy core, or like the host, cluster host, halo, it starts to decline very rapidly. But the same effect is not seen in the field satellites before or after the info. So we then go ahead and look at the properties that would describe what is actually affecting the gas inflow rates. For centrals, it really looks like the gas inflow rates is mainly governed by the halo mass of the cluster or the group it's part of. Whereas the halo mass itself has no effect whatsoever on the gas inflow rates of the satellite sample, and that is same for both the cluster as well as the field satellite samples. And for the satellite sample, most of the correlation is coming from how far ahead it is in the inflow process. So as the galaxies are falling into these host halos, as they get closer to the cluster center, the gas inflow rates for the cluster satellites decrease rapidly, whereas for the more satellite in the fields, again, there was a slight correlation, but it is not enough. It's not governed all that much from the cluster-centric distance. Similarly to the cluster-centric distance, we also see a correlation with the total number of galaxies around, so local density for these galaxies as well. But that's also perhaps because in the cluster center you have generally more number of galaxies in the sample. So we really need to understand, so it looks like, so these galaxies, because they are the most massive galaxies, they were coming in with a lot of gas, but as they are coming to the center of the halo that they are part of at redshift of 2, it really looks like the gas that was available to them before has now either been used up to form the intercluster medium or to feed the cluster central galaxy. And so that means that we should be able to, we should be able to push our observations to see intracluster light at redshifts 2 and above, which is, I'm glad that more work is being done on that, but I will conclude my talk now. We are seeing in the star-forming sample of galaxies, we see most massive protocluster galaxies are starting to show star formation suppression, and that is not an effect of them forming and evolving earlier, but rather perhaps an effect of them having lesser amount of gas to form into stars, and that perhaps one of the reasons that these galaxies have lower amount of gas is because they are simply not able to accrete more gas, leading to a suppression of star formation from processes like strangulation and starvation, rather than just them not being able to, them throwing away the gas from their stellar disk. So stop here and take it.
Thank you. We have time for some questions. Okay, great. This means, okay, good. I have a turn. Okay, this looks like an amazing body of work. I have a lot of questions. So at first I just wanted to make sure that I understood. So you matched your inflow, or you measured your inflow rate. So is that a net rate and it was always inflow, or did you ignore outflows?
We took net inflow.
Okay, great. Oh, well, that's really interesting. Okay, so then I also was a little bit confused looking at the star formation histories. And I think this might be because I am not, this is not really my field thinking about this. But I was very surprised that you had this kind of smooth increase in your star formation rates of your lower mass galaxies. Because if you actually follow the star formation rates in like simulations, your low mass galaxies individual star formation rates are incredibly bursty. And so then you called this star formation rate bursty for your high mass galaxies, but since it's a population, should I really be thinking of it as bursty on an individual galaxy scale?
No, so it would not be on individual galaxy scale, because even with the simulations, the star formation histories for the low mass galaxies is very smooth. It's because all of the bursts in individual galaxies is essentially getting smoothed out because of the averaging.
Okay.
And it's the same for the more observations as well. But also for observations, really, it cannot get resolved star formation bursts up above like 200 to 400 million years or 500 million years. Maybe if you push it 1 giga year, but not beyond that. So that's why we do not do any kind of resolution in time, and we just do a flat there beyond 1 giga year. So that's why you see that kind of a burst and a more smoother star formation history, let's say.
Thank you. Okay, somebody else.
Great talk, great ideas. Do you have a continuity prior in the star formation history? I was curious about that.
Yes, we just use uniform continuity, so for prospector. Yeah.
Okay, so I was wondering if, because at this redshift, I think maybe Stefano will say no, but maybe you can be a bit more generous with your age resolution, because the universe is just younger, you're getting like good features. So I was wondering if you would remove the prior, you would get more burstiness, because it's quite interesting to me also how in the simulations the star formation histories seem very smooth, and I always wonder if that's like real.
So if again the answer is same as it was before, because they are smooth because they are getting what is plotted is the median star formation histories, right? So if there are individual bursts, they are at different time scales, so they will kind of get smoothed out, especially so in the simulations, because there are many galaxies for us to in each spin. As for the, if you change the continuity prior for prospector, I'm not sure if we'll actually see anything much beyond 1 giga year, and for things before 1 giga year or in the last 1 giga year of the for these galaxies, it's the time scales I have taken is similar to the time scales that we have for TNG. So in the first giga year, it's a TNG-like time resolution.
All right, I think we're going to finish up with a Greg question.
So thanks a lot. The plot you had in your conclusions about the different ages of the cluster and field galaxies, and you claim that there was no early formation basically for the protocluster galaxies. I guess my question there is we would expect things in higher overdensities to collapse earlier. And so is the reason you don't see, and this is all galaxies together, this is presumably star forming and quiescent, it's the whole sample.
Yeah.
For the simulations.
Yes, but the simulations, we also put the SFR cut to match the observations.
Oh, so these are only star-forming galaxies.
These are only star-forming
galaxies.
galaxies.
Oh, okay. So that makes it probably pretty hard to interpret the relative ages, because once something stops forming stars, it drops out of your sample, and then you don't.
Right. So as I said, and yes, actually, we see that in TNG as well, at redshift of 2 as well, that there is a higher fraction of quenched galaxies in the most massive bin, and those are simply not here because they are not forming stars, and I really wanted to do a apples-to-apples comparison between observations and simulations.
Right. Thank you.